Cool.
Gonzalo, how's your day? What have you been up to?
I was actually trying to build an extension with the latest cookie cutter and failed miserably. So
Good timing, Gonzalo.
yeah,
Look at Eric's face. He's so gleeful. He's like, yeah, you are. He's like, I haven't written the documents yet. That's why it's failing.
yeah, he's happy.
He's
happy I failed.
You guys spend a lot of time in extension land, don't you?
No.
Not really.
Not really?
That's why
Okay.
it probably doesn't work.
Needs some more practice.
Exactly.
Eric, you're all day in extensions though, right? Or Jupyterlab at least for the most part.
You are what?
Do you work in Jupyter with the extensions all day long?
Oh, no. Are we live now, or?
Yeah, we are live. We haven't started the stream yet, but we are live.
Sure. Yeah, I do have extensions like to connect to the cluster where I is. So this is something where I want to see the status of my jobs. So for Spark job, when you launch an execution, you can wait a few seconds or sometimes 1 minute, and you want to see what's going on. And the Spark extension, which allows you to visualize what is going on the cluster, is very useful. So this is what I mostly use
So
on my day job.
you write Spark and JavaScript during the day? That sounds like a nightmare.
I mean, this is completely different. I mean, Spark is something which you wait a long time to get results, and JavaScript is very nice because you see the result directly in your browser. So, wow, I mean, you jump from one side of the moon to the other side. Well, it's not a nightmare. I mean, it's just something you need to get used to and just play around. And while the Spark job is running, I move back to the JavaScript development stuff, so I can better use my time, actually. So it's nice.
That's super smart. And speaking of time, it's probably about time that we formally got going with this. So we're live right now. If anybody's listening in the chat, please feel free to ask any questions, and we'll try and pass them over. But I'm going to let Fatma take it away now. Thanks, y'all.
All right. Thank you, Tony. Hi, everyone. We are together with another session of Quirkshop, and this time we are in a European-friendly time. And what we're going to do today, we will be talking about Jupyterlab extensions and building tools around that. We have some guests who have been involved in the space and have a lot of experiences and challenges, and they're going to tell us all about them. With that, I want to ask my guests to introduce themselves, who you are, where are you located, and what are you working on right now? Go ahead, I'll start with Gonzalo.
Okay, so hi everyone, my name is Gonzalo Peña. That sounded like jalapeno for some reason. Anyway, so I'm based in Colombia, and I've been working with Quantside for over almost 2 years, I guess, or something like that. And I've been recently working, I started recently working with JLab, so I will have to add the disclaimer, not so much expertise as it was advertised, but I recently worked creating the translation extensions, and I have been working also with some new extensions that I will talk about more briefly. So yeah, happy to share my failures with you.
Thank you, Gonzalo. Ani.
Hey guys, I'm Ani. I'm usually on here as the AV person. Today I'm switching roles. My actual job is as a developer at Quantside. And I say that because typically at Quantside people are spread across many roles. So I work on some packaging stuff with Conda. I work on a lot of Jupyterlab stuff as well. And I primarily consult here as well. So I'm excited to share my experiences, trials, and tribulations with the Jupyterlab of the past, and talk about the Jupyterlab of the future with the people here, like Gonzalo, who have more experience than I do regarding its future status.
Great, thank you, Ani. Eric.
Hi everyone, I am Eric Charles. I jumped into the Jupyter ecosystem 2 years ago because, well, Jupyterlab was a nice piece of software. I mean, very well architectured, and it was to me like the next notebook for data scientists. In the meantime, I've been I've been graduated committer for Jupyterlab. I am also working on Jupyter Server. And I have my own company, which is called Data Layer, and I partner with QuantSight for Jupyter projects.
Great, thank you all. So you have all been involved in the Jupyterlab space and the extensions. What extensions have you worked on so far? Honey.
So I've worked on a couple private extensions for clients. I'm currently working on an extension for a project that we have going on that'll be open source pretty soon. That'll probably show a little later in the space, but I've written 2 extensions for clients before, and I've worked alongside a couple of people on the main dev team. But if we talk about extensions, quite frankly, it's very rare that I have to step into my data science suit, and so it's very rare that I get the opportunity to use Jupyter. But when I do use Jupyter, the extension that I oftentimes always have open is the Dask extension. I just wanted to plug that as my, I think, one-time extension that I would recommend everybody kind of go check out / use. Obviously, the use case is super specific. You'll have to be using Dask. But that being said, I think it's a good example of a very well-written extension for the current state of Jupyterlab.
Great. What about you, Gonzalo? What extensions you have worked on so far?
So yes, as I mentioned before, basically I started doing an external extension, which was a translation extension that allows us to have Jupyterlab in different languages in the interface. That eventually was moved into core, so that became a core extension. Still an extension, it's just bundled with Jupyterlab. Also, I started working recently on some, let's say, private extensions that I will open source soon. And they are mostly regarding how to improve the workflow of checking accessibility and color contrast within Jupyterlab without having to rely with external tools or external URLs. And this is also in tandem with trying to provide a better way to develop theming within Jupyterlab so that it complies with accessibility guidelines. So that's basically what I'm working on right now. It's still pretty alpha, but hopefully in a couple of weeks I would be able to share this with you. So yeah, that's. I also, as part of the work of the translation project, I started helping in other extensions to get the code base internationalized. That means making it translation friendly so that people can then help us with the translations. So not directly with the functionality of the extensions, but I started helping with Jupyterlab Git and the Dask extension that Annie just mentioned. Mm-hmm. So I'm opening a few PRs just to make that happen soon. So probably this week.
That sounds great. Eric, what about you?
Yeah, I would be tempted to say that every time you touch the Jupyterlab code, you work on an extension, because everything is an extension in Jupyterlab.
Yeah, we will get to that too, but I'm glad.
So if you want me to go to the external extensions, I've worked for Jupyterlab Git also, so how you can connect to a Git repository from your Jupyterlab UI, just to pull, to clone, to push, and pull data from Git. I've worked also on a project which allows you to connect from Jupyterlab to Twitter. So you can, from your notebook, do a screenshot of what you do, or the code, or the output of your code. It can be a graph, or it can be text. And you can push that to your Twitter feed. So I think this is quite interesting for people to expose what they do in Jupyterlab.
Yeah, definitely. Is it ready? Is it like being used right now, or is it still in development?
Well, it's on my data layer repository. It is ready, but I think I need to polish a bit, and I need to make a first release. And as soon as it is ready, I'm going to tweet about that for sure.
Yeah, yeah, you should. I think a lot of people will be very interested in that one. Yeah. So I also want to ask you about your favorite extensions. I know, Annie, you mentioned Dusk, and you said you have been using it pretty much extensively. What are some other extensions that are your favorites, and why? Or if there are any.
Gonzalo, do you have any?
Yeah, so I have a couple that I would really like to highlight, and well, there are three that I wanted to highlight, but Binder to showcase one of them just failed also. So yeah, so I'll just talk about two at the moment. But basically, I've recently come across the Jupytext project and the Jupytext extension, and that's an extension that allows you to work on a notebook and pair it with other output formats like Markdown and Mist and Arc Markdown, so that every time you work on your notebook and you hit save, you will get all these files in those formats generated for you, which is a very nice way of getting shareable notebooks that do not have to be the IPython notebook format. And it's also a nice experience to explore how a notebook could look if you wrote it in that format instead of the actual interactive cell interaction that you get with the normal notebook. Maybe I should share my screen so that something that I'm saying makes sense. Yeah, sorry, whoever I took the screen from. So yeah, not this one. Yeah, so this one. So basically, yeah. What is this? Why are you failing on me?
Live demos, man, live demos.
Yeah, I think it failed. So, okay, so while that is reloading,
no worries.
I will show you the other one. And this is another cool extension, and it's the one that introduces Draw.io within Jupyterlab, which basically allows you to create all these cool diagrams. And this is something that I started using recently as part of another project I'm working on, where I'm writing some documentation, and I wanted to convey how the different parts connected to each other. And I was using let's say a commercial software with a free trial, which worked for me, but then the trial ended and I needed something that I could still use within Jupyterlab. And this has been a great extension, and I'm having a lot of fun making my diagrams for this documentation that I'm working on. So I would really encourage you to check it out, because it's a really awesome extension.
That's great. I didn't know that this was an extension now, because I've used Draw.io before and I really like it. That's great. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll just stop sharing and the binder will take some time to load. So in the meantime, maybe Eric for sure has a lot of extensions he would like to share with us.
Yeah, sure. I mean, it depends at what time you ask me the question. Sometimes I develop, sometimes I analyze data. And when I develop, I need to debug the interaction between my Jupyterlab and my server. So in that case, I really love the Kernel Spy extension. It's an extension that allows you to view all the messages that goes between your notebook and your what Jupyter calls kernel. This is the place where your code is run. And when you have that, you can really drill down to the WebSocket messages and find any issue you face. When I am doing more data analysis, obviously I really want to install as many good visualization libraries I can, because the Python ecosystem is so rich that you have Bokeh and Matplotlib and so on. So every library has its own, let's say, sister extension. And if I pick a few ones here, probably I could recommend PyVis, Jupyterlab PyVis, which allows you to visualize very efficiently the output of your widgets. You can have also like a GeoJSON where you need to display maps, and in that case, I can recommend the Jupyterlab GeoJSON extension. And you have a lot more for Matplotlib. You have its own sister extension and so on. That's a bit where I sit when I install extensions. I also like to see what's happening on the server. And if I analyze data, I want to see the status, for example, of my Spark job. In that case, I go and install an extension to visualize and interact with the Spark server.
Great. Ani, did you have any other that you want to mention?
Yeah, the last one I just wanted to give a quick shout out to that I know that's been very helpful with people that use Jupyter frequently is Jupyterlab Git. It's already been mentioned by Gonzalo and Eric. But just to nail it in, it's a really good way to visualize Git from within Jupyterlab. And it helps a lot for people who maybe don't know how to use Git to the fullest extent, which tends to be quite a bit of people that came from data science and kind of do data science work, but are not necessarily familiar with all the software engineering processes. So it really helps speed up, I think, the learning curve of like learning Git and making it easier to visualize from within Jupyterlab itself, which is a huge advantage and time saver when you're kind of working in these ecosystems.
Yeah.
Hey, can I jump in? I'm not part of this. I'm going to jump in because I love extensions so much. And Gonzalo showed a binder, and I'm going to share this this binder in the live chat. But one of my favorite oh crap.
Yeah, we need to beat that later.
Yeah, it busted. Oops.
Well, Tony looks into that. I also I really like what Eric said, like depending on the hat he was wearing, the answer is different. So I guess another one that I'm starting to use more that I always use in my other ID environments where I need to code is the Lsp extension, which basically adds all the introspection and code, linting and other nice goodies from the language server protocol developed by Microsoft, directly integrated with Jupyter. So you get all this functionality, IntelliSense and CodeLens and all these fancy words that do not convey much meaning, but make your development experience much nicer and I would say quicker. There is also on top of that one a new extension that was recently developed, and it's the Kite extension. So Kite brings code completion and a bit of machine learning together, so that instead of getting completion for words, you'll get completion for sentences. So that usually when you do import NumPy as NP, that's like something that a lot of people are doing because that's the convention. So Kite would already, as soon as you start typing NU, it will tell you to complete NumPy as NP. So it does save time when you are doing all these imports. The same for Matplotlib. So import matplotlib.pyplot as PLT. You will get a completion for the whole sentence. So this actually, I mean, they have some benchmarks in terms of how much productive you can be. But in general, being able to see completions in a more contextual sense instead of just the literal sense of the thing that you're completing, it's a huge boost when I'm wearing my developer hat, which is most of the time.
Yeah, I can imagine how helpful that could be with scikit-learn imports, like the long ones.
Yeah. So I would recommend that extension. So it's pretty cool. I'll put it in the document so people can check it.
Yeah, please do that. Thank you. These are great highlights. Thank you, guys. With that, I want to talk a little bit about the anatomy of Jupyterlab. Eric already mentioned that, if you're working in Jupyterlab, like you have to get exposed to extensions. Can you guys tell us a little bit about like how extensions are built, or Jupyterlab is built as extensions, and what does it mean that almost everything in Jupyterlab is an extension?
Eric, maybe you want to take that one?
Sure. So the idea is that all the the parts of the notebook you see on the UI is is underneath provided by an extension. So for example, the file tree you see on the left of Jupyterlab, which allows you to double click on a file to go down into your folder tree. That part is a component as such. And when I mean component, I mean an extension or a plugin. So these are all for Jupyterlab synonyms. What that component or that plugin exposes is basic functions, just like show me the folder, open a file, and so on. This means that another component, and actually this is the main app. So when you open your Jupyterlab, you have a main Jupyterlab application, and that application is built of many extensions. So the file manager, this is one. When you double click on a notebook, you will see the notebook, which is a collection of cells. And that notebook is another extension. You don't see that. Jupyterlab does not tell you. It depends on extension for displaying your cells. But if you look at the code, this is how it is architectured. You get the main app, which collects dependencies and components, extensions, plugins. These are synonyms. And one of them depends on the other one. And sometimes you can say, I have extension one, which is a notebook, which depends on, let's say, a mandatory service. A service can be a connection to a kernel. I said a kernel is where the code is run, where the code is executed. But when you open a notebook, you need that service. You need that connection to the kernel. And this is a mandatory extension for the notebook to have the service. An optional one would be like the search. I mean, if you do Command F in a notebook, you get like the small widget on the top right where you can search something. But I mean, this may be an optional dependency because not all notebooks are able to search. And only if you have a plugin which delivers a search, sometimes you don't want to search across a file, whatever, you, yeah, I see that now, if it is there. This may be an optional plugin or optional extension. So I don't know if we're going to move to the code, but this is how it is written. You have a main app which collects dependencies, which are the extensions, and every extension depends on the other one, and with mandatory or optional ones.
I see.
So
yeah, go ahead.
So maybe to are you guys seeing my screen? Sorry.
Yep.
So yeah, to echo on Eric's explanation, basically, okay, so we should probably expand on that a bit after, and is that we can have front-end extensions and we can have back-end extensions that work on the server. We'll get that in a minute. But just looking at the front, and when you look at the Jupyterlab code base and the packages subdirectory, you will see that there are a bunch of, let's call packages. These are all packages. So you have a console package that provides a console widget plus a lot of functionalities around consoles. And then you have extensions. And this is kind of like the way this is architecture, like Eric mentioned. So you have the common things that may not be entirely tied to Jupyterlab. Like you have a code editor, which in the case of, you have a code mirror package, which basically wraps code mirror, which is another open source package, and add some things on top of it. And then you have the extension, which actually would embed this editor that we now have here as a code cell. So this is how it's more or less architecture. You have packages that provide basic functionality, and then you have the extensions that could have optional or require extensions on other extensions. Or
yeah, maybe you can go down to the code mirror extension to show what it depends on.
Yes,
so.
Absolutely. So if we go to the code mirror extension and we look at what it depends on, we can see that it depends on the main application. So basically all extensions will depend on the application because they need the application to be able to register as an extension. Then you see that it depends on the code editor, package, doc registry, file editor, the main menu, because this is adding a bunch of things to the menus. For instance, if you go to the settings and you see how the indentation, this will affect the editor that is being used. So normally an extension will affect many other plugins, will add stuff to the status bar, so we depend on the status bar. And because this is a plugin that now also provides translation, it will also depend on the translation package to connect to it. So when looking at extensions, I mean, if they live in the Jupyterlab repository, we can call them internal, but basically, as Eric stated, everything is an extension. So probably something that is confusing and it will help would be to actually unify the words plugin and extension and component, because it can be misleading to use the same word to describe things that could be similar, but not necessarily. Let me just stop sharing here.
Oh. Thank you, Gonzalo. And you quickly touched upon it, but I want to ask, what is the difference between extensions and server extensions in Jupyterlab?
Yeah, so maybe Eric has more information on that.
I'd like to add one more question to that. Which are easier for somebody to dive into? Also.
So
Sorry. In terms of what extension would be easier?
Yeah, like is a front end like what do I have to know to build a front end extension versus what do I have to know to build a back end extension? Like which one might be easier for certain folks?
Well, first let's make a difference between front end and back end. Well, front end is when you want to modify or to expose to the UI in your browser something. So I could say you can change this. You can add a menu, for example, just to open a file or to open a file with some name patterns. So this could be an extension which does not depend on the server, because you just have to adapt the front end part of Jupyterlab. If you need some more, let's say some more advanced feature which depend on the server. So let's say, for example, the Git one is a good one. I want to clone and I want to push to a server. In that case, to a Git server. In that case, a decision has been made to drive the request to the server, to the Jupyter server, which has himself the connection to the Git repositories. So all the interactions to clone and so on goes from the browser to the Jupyter server, which goes after to the Git repository. In that case, what you have to develop is a companion extension, which is not only the front-end Jupyterlab UI, but which is also a piece of Python software, which is registered in the Jupyter ecosystem as a well-known extension on the server side. And that one will expose like endpoints that can be reached from the UI. In the Jupyterlab Git, you have an endpoint to clone, to push, to pull, and so on. And all that can be bundled in one, let's say, definition. And when you install an extension, you get both. You get the client and you get the server.
Real quick before we continue, hey Travis, welcome to your first quirkshop. Thanks for joining us.
Hi Travis.
Hey, Travis. Oh, we can't hear
everybody. Hi.
Hey
no,
there.
it's great. I love what's happening here. I can't always come, but I love it if I can. So I wanted to jump in on this one, especially. So thanks everybody.
Yeah, thanks for letting us do this. It's a good discussion about extensions so far. It's exciting to see where we keep going.
So, yep.
So I guess with the question that Tony was asking, like, what would be the easiest to dive? So I guess the easiest thing when you want to maybe understand a bit of how things work is just go to the Jupyterlab core extensions and just change something and see what happens when you run this in development mode. Because with this, you don't have to start an extension from scratch. And sometimes even when you start it, you don't really know what you can do. So I guess or at least the way I dove into extensions was just looking at the core and started breaking it and see how things change. And then from there, I really gather a lot of information on how things work. Sometimes the code base can be a bit abstract, and that's okay. You'll get to there at some point when you need it. And it also depends like what you're comfortable with. Like the whole code base in Jupyterlab is written in TypeScript. So for those unfamiliar with that, it's just JavaScript with types, which actually helps a lot in maintaining a big code base like Jupyterlab, and it would make it really hard if it was just pure vanilla JavaScript. So if you're not super comfortable with that, TypeScript is not that different from Python when you get used to it if you're using Python with types. So just give it a go. If that's not something that appeals to you, well, you could start with a server extension that starts at least providing some endpoints to the application so that you can play with something you are familiar with in the Python world. But inevitably, if you want to really exercise the full power of Jupyterlab and all its components, you would probably need to work with TypeScript. And also on an extra note on this is that the way Jupyterlab is built, it really allows for anyone to just grab the things that you need and kind of like create a bundle, like your own lab application, like the Fatma lab, if you will, that would provide already the things that you want and the things that you don't want, you just get rid of them. And because it's like a bunch of Legos, you can really start building your perfect interface if the default plus the extensions that Jupyterlab provide are not enough or not good enough.
Great. Thank you, Gonzalo.
As a developer, I just wanted to say Eric has done a lot of work actually as a developer. When I came to the ecosystem first, the code base was completely unapproachable. Just as a kind of like JavaScript noob that kind of came from systems and more of a computational background to the front end era, but of like the world moving forward. But I wanted to say that Eric's work in kind of moving things over to React and making React extensions an applicable way to build extensions for Jupyterlab has made extension building a lot easier for Jupyterlab. And that's obviously twofold. It's because React developers are like significantly more than the people that know how the actual internal library within Jupyterlab works, which makes it easier for them to approach and program extensions for Jupyterlab, excuse me.
Yeah, I mean, so thank you. Yeah, the Jupyter React question is a topic as such. I really would love us to have a dedicated workshop on that later on. I mean, it was like to spend time on that. I'm gonna maybe echo on Gonzalo and to answer the question, how can I start with extension and server extensions? I'm trying to share a screen, but I don't find the Jitsi button for that.
Bottom left
It's
looks
the
like a
monitor,
computer
the bottom
screen.
left.
Bottom left?
Yeah.
No, I have that on my screen, but I mean, I'm going to share in the chat the repository for, where is the chat? Here. So if someone wants to go and start somewhere, it's not the only place. There are other places, for example, that one, which is inside. The second one is inside the Jupyterlab repository. But the first one, the extension examples, we build that with a few open source contributor exactly to help people on board on extension, because as Annie said, this is very frustrating to see so many extensions, so many line of code. You don't know where to start. And in that Jupyterlab extension examples repository, we have the very basic one, which is, oh, I want to add a menu, I want to add a setting or probably I want to, if you go to the advanced one, I want to build a Jupyterlab UI, which talks with the server extension. So this is something you will find in, I see the screen. I'm going to wait for you to
Gonzalo.
Yeah, sorry, Eric, I'm going to be your eyes. So
Go to the advanced one, advanced. And you will get server extension over there. And if you follow the tutorial, I mean, it's very step by step, you will get that UI connecting with the server. In this case, it's very, very basic because we want to make it very, very simple for people. And that in the console of the browser, that message comes back from the server. So this is a very good place to start playing with extensions.
So in addendum to Eric's point there, Gonzalo, can I share the screen? Can I steal the screen from you?
Sure.
I just wanted to share. I think this is going to be the right window. Let's hope so. I actually cloned the basic cookie cutter example this weekend, since I was working on something. I just wanted to show this is kind of the setup of the current Jupyterlab kind of extension package, and you can see it looks kind of exactly like a you would expect an npm package to look when you're not using the server extension, which is super nice. But like Eric said, it's very, very step by step. So it allows you to actually build each portion. So you can see that the source file here is actually made up of a bunch of components, as you would expect with React's kind of design philosophy, and an index file that literally exposes these things into give me 1 second, that exposes the actual application into Jupyterlab itself. So this is super neat because you can essentially, like Eric and Gonzalo were saying, you can actually create menu items and add them to the menu, and it's very explicit and explicitly done. So it's very easy for us to see. So I just wanted to also share that the actual extension at its current moment, of course, is nowhere near completion. But you can see that it's added to the menu here, that you have this little button, you can launch it, and it launches this, and we have buttons, and we have a full-blown React application from within Jupyterlab itself. And this was done maybe in an hour and a half or so. Point being is that the examples like Eric shared are very, very straightforward and are typically in line and work out of the box with most of the React documentation. So if you're coming to this as a React developer, you should spend minimal to like no time being able to get onboarded to I guess the idea and philosophy behind building Jupyterlab extensions. So it makes it really quick and easy to spin up. For all the extensions I've done thus far, I haven't needed to actually write a server extension yet, but I'm sure I'll have to at some point in time. But obviously, those examples were kind of the savior with screenshots telling me exactly where things were, so I could add them to specific areas. I think the documentation has been improved significantly since where it was like 6 months ago. And for that reason, I'm now seriously comfortable recommending exactly what Eric was talking about, which are those examples. I even stole his code this weekend, and I was like, Eric, so I stole your code base.
Thank you, guys. I think these are very important and useful for those who want to get on
it. A community effort. I mean, the extension is really something. Well, all the Jupyterlab ecosystem is somewhat something which is not only a few people work, but a lot of people. So a lot of people contribute to that, and we're looking forward any contribution to add some more example to make it better, and looking forward to that.
Great, thank you. So my next question is more from the user perspective. Why is it so important to have extensions in scientific computing workflows, especially in the interactive ones? And why do you think users should know about extensions?
Just as a user, I think it's like Vim. I use Vim for my normal text editing, but when I use Jupyter, it's typically for a different purpose. I think about problems that I'm answering with Jupyter very differently than I would think about them in Vim. And when I'm solving scientific problems, I typically use libraries like Dask and Numba and NumPy and Pandas, and all of these things have huge benefits when you couple them with extensions, because it makes it really, really easy to see exactly what you're computing, where you're computing. And Jupyterlab is kind of hackable to the core. So you can really customize it for your needs. You know, sometimes, as much as I love Vim and Emacs, they're just not the answer in scientific computing environments where I might have to interactively, you know, play with data. And I'd like to see result outputs immediately, and I'd like to interact with graphs. So from that standpoint, I can customize Jupyterlab to be really small, really fast, and work exactly the way I want it to, coupled with extensions. That's just the way I look at it as a user. I mean, they're just really important to maximize my kind of experience from within Jupyterlab itself.
Yeah, I think as a data analyst, you need many different libraries, and it really depends on the job you do. I mean, a biological analysis is not, let's say, a social network analysis. So the libraries, but also the visualization you get from in the notebook is completely different. So I find it very useful and required that Jupyterlab is extensible so that user can adapt it depending on their use case. And I would even say and that sometimes we don't know if we have to ship an external dependency as a core one. I mean, the core is the one that you get for free when we download the Jupyterlab package, or you install the Jupyterlab package, you get the core extensions. And I'm going to take an example. Recently, we added the TOC, the table of content extension. So that extension has been living outside of Jupyterlab for a while, has been developed and has evolved quite well. And at some point, it has been merged in core. But it's always a trade-off. You don't know if you really want that in core or not. And I would even advocate that probably the core should be lighter. I mean, the core of the core should be very basic one. And maybe it's good enough for people who want to visualize Panda data frame, maybe. Maybe they just need a very small core and installing a Panda visualization on top. But they don't need probably the TOC and all the bells and whistles you have today. So it's a trade-off. I mean, and it's even an open discussion in the community. What do we pull as core extension or not? And but I mean, it's not an issue because Jupyterlab design has been done to support a very small core. It's like, I mean, the core, the Linux kernel is very small, and you can add, well, people have packaged that to make it very, very powerful and to answer a lot of requirements. But the kernel as such, the core of Linux is small, and Jupyterlab can be very, very small, and user can add what they want.
I'll probably just jump in with a very small statement to answer Fatma's question, and is in my specific case, what I really like in terms of, or why is it important for users, is that when you're working in any field, you really need to visualize things from different views. So maybe the same plot has a different aspect to it, a different way of grouping things, or just like with GIS, that you have different layers that stack on top of each other. So being able to create an extension that will render the same data in a different perspective and being able to compare them side by side, it's really powerful, both in finding any insight from whatever you're seeing, and also in specific cases, you sometimes just need to see many different views of the same thing just to be able to understand how things work. So visualization is something that I can really identify with. And it's something that I think is very important for users to know wanting to go into extension development, is how they can develop a new visualization for a given data set or a given data structure. Go, Tony. You had a question?
Well, I mean, I agree with everything that you said, but I want to make sure that we're getting to the audience. We actually have, this is our first question from the audience. Oh, no, this is the second question. I've already answered one of them. But Melissa is curious. Are there good first issues tagged for experienced React developers who aren't familiar with Jupyterlab but would like to contribute?
I think we have good first issues in general, but I don't think that currently there is a distinction between that specific technology stack, but that's probably a good idea and something we should be doing. So not that I'm aware of.
Well, thanks, Gonzalo. Yeah, I've always found it curious how many Python developers love Python so much that they want to write JavaScript for the rest of their careers. I don't know how we get people experienced enough in JavaScript to help us.
All right. Are there any more audience questions, Tony?
That's all. Thank you.
Okay, so I have one last question before we move to Ani's demo. We know that Jupyterlab is preparing for a 3.0 release, and it seems like there are going to be some major changes in the extension system. Could you guys tell us about that a little? What should we expect in terms of changes?
So I think we should talk about how things I think currently stand today before we talk about changes that are made and how kind of the current extension ecosystem is built. So Gonzalo, Eric, feel free to jump in because you guys are obviously the experts. But basically, currently today we have Python packages and Yarn packages essentially, or NPM packages. And these kind of two components together make up extension frameworks today. As one can tell, this can be kind of difficult because you have to juggle the extensions between Python and JavaScript/TypeScript unless you're building a TypeScript front-end only application. So obviously this is kind of really hard and kind of a problem to solve, which is why we're shipping things today through NPM as a server extension and a front-end extension separately. But in 3.0, those things are due to change, and Eric's kind of actually leading some of that work, and he's moving it forward.
Yeah, well, I'm not leading. I'm just following a bit. A few people working very hard to make it happen. And as you said, Annie, well, there were before in Jupyterlab 1 and version 2 also ways to package the NPM library into Python, but that was very custom and that was like something that Jupyterlab Git does, but there was no standard way to do that. So the first change with Jupyterlab 3 is a well standard and documented way to package everything in a Python library. So when you need to install an extension, you don't need to go to NPM, you don't need to go to Conda, you just install from Conda or PyPy, and you get everything set up. This is a first improvement, but there is another improvement which I find also very, very impressive. In the version 1 and version 2 world, what you had to do when you were installing something was a complete rebuild of the Jupyterlab that was running. And a rebuild, this means JavaScript rebuild. This means that you need to have Node.js on your machine. And sometimes you need to wait quite some time. I mean, 30 seconds, 1 minute, or maybe more. Because when you are a power user, you need a lot of extensions, and the more extensions you install, the longer it takes to build. This means that every time someone adds an extension, it needs to rebuild. This is completely removed in Jupyterlab 3. And this is awesome. I mean, this is something that I hope will develop more the ecosystem, because the pain to install an extension is going to normally disappear. You just click and you get directly the functionality without a build, without having to install Node.js on your machine. So to me, these are two changes: packaging Python and hot reload of the hot install of the extension.
So we're gonna pip install JavaScript. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, exactly.
All right. The future is now, isn't it? Stephanie had a question. She actually did an awesome stream this weekend with Juanita on Spider. I don't know if anybody caught that. But she was wondering, how do you choose the extension that's going to be developed? I know, Gonzalo, specifically, you were like, hey, this extension doesn't exist, so I'm going to make it. Does anybody else have any experiences like that?
I think that's mostly, I mean, you already answered for me. Thanks, Tony. But I guess like a lot of developers is basically we're scratching our own itches. So whatever thing that it's hindering you, or you think that you could improve your productivity by having something extra on Jupyterlab, that's probably the best place where you should try to improve it, because you have a drive to make things better for you and you alone. And maybe in that process, you help a bunch of people. So it's a very, oh, I forgot the word. When you do things just for yourself, like it's a very,
selfish?
Someone, yeah, that one. So
There
it's a very selfish motivation, but at the end, you will end up helping a lot of people, because if you open source that work, then many people will benefit from your own itches and can scratch them with your extension.
Thank you so much, Gonzalo.
Thank you, Gonzalo. So we are almost out of time, so I don't want to squeeze Annie's demo. So hopefully we will have another session in the Jupyterlab series. So we will save it for that, Annie. I have one more question. What extensions would you guys like to see that don't exist today?
Who's going to take that first?
Travis is going to take this one.
Well, I would say there's a lot of extensions that already exist for Jupyter. Like if you go look at the IPython extensions, they're actually quite popular. A lot of people wrote a lot of extensions. One of the challenges is that we've had some experience trying to actually port some of those extensions to Jupyterlab and had all kinds of difficulty. Like it was way too hard. And so companies are not. There's all kinds. There's automated bots. There's scheduling extensions. There's code review extensions. Like you could literally just go down the list of existing Jupyter Notebook extensions and say, where is this for Jupyterlab? And that'll keep you busy for a couple of years.
That sounds so daunting.
Yeah. Well, it's why making them easier is such a priority.
Right.
That's why making extensions easy to do for the occasional developer is so critical.
Or the scientist that needs to do something occasionally different too, right? It just needs to be that easy, I suppose.
Yeah, the occasional developer is a word I use to describe the fact that Python and Jupyter attracts this large group of people who otherwise didn't take computer science. They don't consider themselves hardcore devs. They have some expertise in some other area. They're a domain expert in some other area, and they come to the Python community and the Jupyter community. And if you shove them with this sort of something that takes a PhD in computer science to deal with, or 10 years of experience as a developer to deal with, they just don't.
Yeah. It's a different form of accessibility, I suppose.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. Great point.
So so now that you mentioned that, probably like one of the things that I would like to see, and I'm trying to also work on that on my inexistent spare time, but is like, how can you actually make this experience of developing something for Jupyterlab within Jupyterlab easy, so that you actually can do the thing inside Jupyterlab and see the results right away, even if you're breaking stuff, and maybe not have to rely into an external more traditional IDE for develop software. So I guess whatever makes it easier for users to start doing something right there in Jupyterlab would be a huge win, and it's something that I'm personally invested in and working on a bit. So maybe in a future quirkshop we can see a demo of that. Fingers
I love
crossed.
these quirkshops just write themselves, don't they? Eric's already suggested one. Gonzalo suggested one. It sounds like through this 2 to 3 transition, maybe y'all would like to do your own little spin-off and have a consistent quirkshop going through as Jupyterlab updates their extensions.
Sure.
That would be fun. We'll get that scheduled and make that stuff public. I think that people would have enjoyed this discussion, and I appreciate y'all for doing this. And thank you, Fatma, for hosting.
Thank you so much, everyone, and thank you to our audience that joined us today. And we'll see you next time.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much for
Thank you,
joining.
everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks for all the work you build.
Bye.